The library had been abandoned for decades, rooms filled with crumbling manuscripts, forgotten knowledge, erased history. But when Ibrahim Traoré opened one specific book, a chronicle written by African scholars in the 15th century, he realized why it had been hidden. The truth was too powerful to allow. September 2025. Ibrahim Traoré stood in the doorway of the Ahmed Baba Institute in Timbuktu, Mali, staring at centuries of dust and neglect. The institute, named after a legendary 16th century scholar, housed one of Africa's most important manuscript collections, over 100,000 texts covering mathematics, astronomy, medicine, law, and history. But decades of conflict, underfunding, and deliberate neglect had left the building in ruins. Shelves sagged under the weight of crumbling pages. Water damage had destroyed entire sections. And many of the most valuable manuscripts had been stolen, smuggled to private collections in Europe and the Middle East. Traoré had come to Timbuktu as part of a broader Pan-African heritage recovery initiative. His goal was to assess what remained, digitize what could be saved, and repatriate manuscripts that had been taken. But what he found in that library would become far more significant than a preservation project. It would become a weapon in the battle to reclaim African identity. The head librarian, an elderly scholar named Dr. Amadou Hampate, greeted Traoré with weary hope. "Mr. President, I'm grateful you're here, but I must be honest. Much has been lost. Wars, looters, time itself. We've tried to protect what we can, but resources are limited." Traoré placed a hand on the man's shoulder. "Show me what you've saved. Even one surviving manuscript is a victory against erasure." They walked through rows of shelves, past texts on Islamic jurisprudence, astronomical charts mapping star movements with precision that rivaled European Renaissance observations, medical treatises describing surgical techniques. Traoré stopped frequently, carefully lifting pages, reading passages in Arabic and Old Mandinka script. Each document was a testament to a civilization that had been systematically written out of global history. Then, in a back room that had been locked and largely forgotten, Dr. Hampate opened a reinforced cabinet. "These are our most fragile items," he explained. "We keep them sealed to prevent further deterioration. Some haven't been opened in 50 years. Inside were a dozen leather-bound volumes, their covers worn but intact. Hampate gently removed one and placed it on a cushioned stand. "This one, I've never fully examined it. The binding suggests it's very old, perhaps 14th or 15th century." Traoré leaned in as Hampate carefully opened the cover. The first page was written in elegant Arabic calligraphy. The title read, Tariq al-Muluk al-Ifriqiya, the Chronicle of African Kings, authored by the Council of Scholars of the Sankore University, completed in the year 872 of the Hijra. Traoré did the mental calculation. The year 872 in the Islamic calendar corresponded to 1468 CE. This manuscript was over 550 years old, and it had been written by African scholars at a time when Timbuktu was one of the world's greatest centers of learning, home to the famous Sankore University, where thousands of students studied law, philosophy, science, and theology. But what made Traoré's pulse quicken was the subtitle, written below the title, a complete account of the kingdoms, wealth, governance, and achievements of the African continent, recorded so that future generations may know the truth of their ancestors. This wasn't just a historical record, it was a deliberate act of preservation. The scholars who wrote it knew that their world might one day be threatened, their history questioned. So they documented everything. Traoré spent the next 6 hours reading. The manuscript was over 300 pages, written in dense, precise script. It covered the major African kingdoms of the medieval period: Mali, Songhai, Kanem-Bornu, Great Zimbabwe, the Swahili city-states. But it went far beyond simple chronology. It described political systems, economic networks, technological innovations, and cultural achievements in extraordinary detail. One section described the governance structure of the Mali Empire under Mansa Musa. It outlined a federal system where regional governors reported to a central council, a judicial system with appeals courts, a taxation system based on wealth rather than tribute, and a constitutional framework called the Kurukan Fuga that guaranteed rights to citizens and limited the power of the emperor. The document even included the text of this constitution. 240 years before the Magna Carta was written in England, African kingdoms had codified laws protecting individual rights. Another section detailed trade networks. The manuscript listed over 80 cities across Africa connected by trade routes, describing the goods exchanged: gold, salt, textiles, books, ivory, spices, and the economic treaties that governed commerce. It described a trans-Saharan trade system so sophisticated that merchants used letters of credit, a banking concept Europe wouldn't adopt until centuries later. There were sections on education. The manuscript documented universities in Timbuktu, Djenné, and Gao, listing the subjects taught and the number of students enrolled. One passage noted that Sankore University alone had over 25,000 students in the 15th century, making it larger than any European university of the same period. The scientific achievements were staggering. The Chronicle described astronomical observatories that had mapped the movement of planets, medical schools where surgeons performed cataract removal and set broken bones with metal pins, engineering projects like irrigation systems and multi-story stone buildings. One entry described a mathematician named Al-Hajj Muhammad ibn al-Hassan, who had calculated the Earth's circumference to within 200 kilometers of the correct figure, accomplished in Africa in 1456, decades before European explorers would make similar calculations. But perhaps the most powerful section was near the end of the manuscript. It was titled, "A Warning to Our Descendants." Traore read it slowly, his hands gripping the edges of the stand. "We write these words in a time of greatness, but we are not foolish. We see the ships from distant lands arriving on our coasts. We hear reports of pale-skinned men with strange weapons and stranger ambitions. Some among us believe they come in peace, seeking trade. Others fear they come to conquer. We do not know the future, but we know this: if ever our kingdoms fall, if ever our knowledge is questioned, if ever strangers tell our children that we were savages who built nothing, learned nothing, achieved nothing, let this chronicle stand as proof against their lies. We were here. We built empires. We created knowledge. We lived with dignity and wisdom. And no matter what they say, no matter what they write in their books, the truth is recorded here. Guard it, protect it, share it, so that one day, when Africa rises again, our children will know who they truly are." Traore closed the book carefully. His throat was tight. He turned to Dr. Hampate, who had been watching silently. "This manuscript," Traore said quietly, "changes everything." Over the following weeks, Traore mobilized a team of international historians, linguists, and preservation experts. The manuscript was digitized using the most advanced non-invasive scanning technology. Every page was photographed in ultra-high resolution. Carbon dating confirmed the age. Linguistic analysis verified the authenticity of the script. And independent historians cross-referenced the Chronicle's claims with other sources: archaeological findings, oral histories, fragmentary records from Arab travelers. Everything checked out. The Chronicle of African Kings was real. But Traore knew that simply proving authenticity wasn't enough. For centuries, African history had been distorted, minimized, or erased from global education. Textbooks taught that Africa had no significant civilizations before European contact, that Africans had contributed nothing to science or philosophy, that colonization was a civilizing mission rather than exploitation. This manuscript directly contradicted all of that, but releasing it would trigger resistance, denial, attempts to discredit it. So Traoré planned carefully. He organized an international symposium in Ouagadougou, inviting historians from universities across Africa, Europe, Asia, and the Americas. He invited UNESCO representatives, media outlets, and educational organizations. And on October 15, 2025, before a packed auditorium and millions watching via livestream, he unveiled the Chronicle of African Kings. The presentation was methodical and devastating. Traoré stood beside a massive screen displaying pages from the manuscript. He began with the facts, the age, the authorship, the verification process. Then he read passages aloud, translating them from Arabic to French and English. He showed the constitutional laws, the trade networks, the scientific achievements, and he compared them to European developments of the same period. While this chronicle was being written in 1468, Traoré said, describing universities with tens of thousands of students, Europe was still decades away from the Renaissance. While African scholars were mapping stars and performing surgery, European medicine was still using leeches and blaming illness on evil spirits. While African kingdoms had codified legal systems protecting citizen rights, European monarchs ruled by divine right with no constitutional limits. He paused, letting the weight of the evidence settle. This is not to diminish European achievements. It is simply to state a fact that has been hidden for too long. Africa was not a backward continent waiting to be civilized. Africa had empires, knowledge systems, technological innovations, and cultural achievements that equaled or surpassed anything elsewhere in the world. And that history was deliberately erased. He held up the manuscript. The scholars who wrote this knew it would be challenged, so they left us a warning and a gift. The warning: guard the truth, because others will try to bury it. The gift: evidence so comprehensive that even centuries later, it cannot be denied. The response was seismic. Within 24 hours, the digitized manuscript was downloaded over 10 million times. Universities across Africa immediately began integrating it into curricula. International historians issued statements acknowledging its significance, and textbook publishers faced mounting pressure to revise their content. But there was also resistance. Some Western academics questioned the interpretation, arguing that the manuscript was being politicized. Others suggested that even if authentic, it represented an outlier, not a continent-wide reality. And certain political voices dismissed it entirely, calling it revisionist history designed to promote African nationalism. Traoré anticipated this. In a follow-up press conference, he addressed the critics directly. To those who say this is revisionist history, I respond, what we were taught was the revision. European colonizers wrote African history to justify their conquest. They said we had no civilization, so they could claim to bring civilization. They said we had no knowledge, so they could claim to educate us. They said we had no achievements, so they could claim credit for development. This manuscript doesn't revise history, it restores it. He continued, and to those who say this is just one document, one kingdom, one moment in time, you're right. It is one document. But it opens the door to thousands more. Across this continent, in libraries, private collections, and buried archives, there are manuscripts, oral histories, and archaeological sites that tell the same story. We've simply been taught to ignore them. That ends now. The Chronicle of African Kings became more than a historical document. It became a symbol. Schools named themselves after it. Artists created works inspired by its passages. Pan-African organizations used excerpts in their campaigns. And most importantly, a generation of young Africans read it and felt something shift inside them, a sense of pride, of connection to a heritage that had been stolen and was now being reclaimed. 1 year after the discovery, a 16-year-old student in Lagos, Nigeria, wrote an essay that went viral on social media. She described reading the Chronicle for the first time and realizing that her ancestors hadn't been waiting for Europeans to bring progress. They had been building progress themselves. "I used to feel like African history started when Europeans arrived," she wrote. "Now I know our history is thousands of years deep, and it's ours to reclaim." Traore read that essay and felt the purpose of his work crystallize. History wasn't just about the past, it was about identity, dignity, and the future. A people who knew their history couldn't be convinced they were inferior. A continent that understood its achievements couldn't be told it needed outsiders to succeed. The Chronicle of African Kings had been hidden for centuries, but now it was out, and it was rewriting not just textbooks, but consciousness, because the truth, once revealed, cannot be buried again.